Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Margarita. We have with us Margarita Acosta, the founder of Peaceful Warrior Coaching. Welcome. And tell us a little bit about your firm, about your work, and how you came to this work.
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all. Um, well, I've been working for the last 5 years or so as a somatic and wellness and mindfulness coach in schools. And
Mm.
then I started this organization, this business, just within the last few months, and extending it out a little bit more broadly to working with environmental activists, language activists, as well as educators.
Mm.
So Peaceful Warrior Coaching is about how can we create spaces where we can be healing centered for ourselves in our interpersonal relationships and the organizations, and ultimately also to make the systems that we're a part of healthier, ideally. And Peaceful Warrior Coaching the name comes from my time when I was in the classroom, and I would call my students my peaceful warriors.
Oh.
And so my curriculum became, when I was still in the classroom working with elementary school students, around a lot of it was around like, how can we, stand up for justice? How can we, learn to move through conflict more effectively? And how can we be healing centered with one another? And then I kind of like followed that into the nonprofit that I worked for the last few years, working in schools and organizations so that, ideally someday we're part of systems that we don't have to heal from, right? And
Wow.
a little bit more of that context is, I was a movement baby during the Salvadoran Civil War, which happened from 1980 to 1992. I was born in 1986.
So
My
right in the middle.
father, so right in the middle, I was born during it. And I was born in the United States. My father was a refugee from El Salvador. My parents met as my father was speaking out against the U.S. involvement in the Salvadoran Civil War. So there's a lot of parallels, in the ways in which, you know, El Salvador's history and Palestinian history it's the same story, different characters, right? Um, and so the village that my father's from is also where the resistance movement sparked, in El Salvador. And he was he was part of the resistance movement, but not the guerrilla movement. He decided to be part of the nonviolent resistance movement. And so, my family's legacy is one of like nonviolent resistance. Um, as For him, he was in seminary to be a priest before the war started, but he got excommunicated by the right wing church. But he still was a follower of Oscar Romero, who was one of his teachers, and then his assassination as someone who's speaking out for the poor, for the campesinos who are mostly indigenous. When he was assassinated, that marked the beginning of the Civil War in 1980. And then my father fled the country probably within a year of that. He was blacklisted for his involvement in low-income housing projects. And then he spent much of the first half of the 80s traveling throughout. He first got asylum in Mexico, and then with an organization based out of Canada, he was able to get a bunch of his family asylum in Canada. And then he was traveling around with an organization that was speaking out against the US involvement. So he came to the United States. That's how he met my mother. And then when I was 4 years old, we moved back to El Salvador in 1990 to be they were both in collaboration, part of the negotiations to end the war. And so this kind of legacy of how do we move through conflict, even in the context of war, has been a huge part of
Has always
my,
been there.
it's always been there in my family and in the work that my parents have been doing. Um, I would say that the ways in which, I've evolved beyond the work that they were doing is, you know, they were working themselves to death. They were working
Mm-hmm.
beyond their physical capacity to
Mm-hmm.
to um to work on a daily basis, financially taking hits, just trying to just make it work to survive and to help my father's side of the family survive. And um, you know, diet was not a priority. And so for me, when I started my teaching career, I noticed myself in these same patterns of like working 80-hour weeks when I was starting my career in San Francisco at a Title I school, which means, low income,
By proportion of
high
the
need.
income. Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Um, and so I was just like finding myself in these patterns of um,
Well, depletion is
not
what
being,
I'm hearing.
yeah, being really depleted. Um, and so in my third year of teaching, I did a yoga teacher training and found Ayurveda and all these things and started practicing somatics. Um, and then switched over to a different methodology of education. I found Montessori as, more holistic. Um, although even the like
And democratic.
holistic way,
Right?
definitely democratic, has much more capacity of teaching children how to be autonomous in a classroom. And I would say that, the public Montessori schools that I worked within were not just about peace education, but about education for liberation. Right. And there's a difference between peace and liberation. And right now, what Palestinians are calling out for is liberation and not just a
And
false
not just for
peace,
peace.
right? Like real
Yeah.
peace.
So I have a lot of questions. The question I wasn't gonna ask you, but that I have had is um I know a little bit about the Guatemalan Civil War and the counterinsurgency there. Um, I'm not seeing a lot of people looking at Israel's repression of Gaza as a counterinsurgency, but um, do you see parallels? Like, what do you like? It's
Yeah.
not
I
just
mean,
land grab. There's also like, yeah, but what are some parallels you can draw between what's happening in Gaza and what happened in El Salvador, if you do see some?
yeah. And I will admit that like my learning about Palestinian resistance is much newer, right? Like October 6th was like a waking up. It always, since college, like, and even before college, actually, there's someone in our family, a family friend who has been active in Palestine for a long time. So I've been, you know, very broadly aware of there being an issue in that region of the world, and I hadn't quite delved as deeply as I have recently. Um, and you know, I'm learning about all the ways in which peace movements have been just systematically undermined. Um, you know, Israel, the current Israeli government, Netanyahu, like calling for actually, energizing Hamas so that there's an excuse to instigate violence and do what they're doing right now. Um, it's really scary.
The parallel
Yeah.
that I noticed, and I don't know as much about El Salvador, but the parallel that I noticed is that they seem to be targeting civil society, like churches, like hospitals, like poets, and that in Guatemala, what we learned is that more humanitarian workers were killed than guerrillas
Yeah.
in the counterinsurgency, and that's what has me thinking of Central America.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, in El Salvador, I don't know exactly what the statistics are, but 80,000 people were killed over the 12-year civil war. Um, and the majority of those were women and children and civilians, who, you know, they just wanted basic human rights in the same way that people in Palestine want basic human rights. Um, uh, you know, people in modern day Israel, Palestinians who are living within that context want rights. People in Gaza want rights. People in the West Bank, same thing. Like, you know, it's um there's so many, there's a lot of parallels, right, between, you know, right now it's like they're labeling Palestinians as all being part of Hamas. Back then it was like any person, any campesino, any person that was on the left in El Salvador was a communist, right? Everybody was labeled a communist and part of the guerrilla movement, when that wasn't necessarily the case. You know, there were just people trying to eat. So, and
Yeah.
there's so many ways in which I feel like the history of El Salvador now, you know, 92 to now, it's 30 years later since the peace accords were signed, and the ways in which trauma have not been healed, and the
Mm,
implications for the ways in which Salvadorans, including my own family, are currently living with trauma in our bodies, generational, ancestral, and, you know, for,
active. Yeah.
you know, I have a lived memory of, you know, growing up in El Salvador and having to, um, you know, sleep in the kitchen because there were bombs being dropped in my community where we lived. And so, like, that is something that I'm going to heal from my entire life. And I didn't even have a limb, you know, amputated from my body with that anesthesia. So, you know, the implications for what we're seeing right now are just horrible.
Mm.
Um, and
I
so a
feel
lot
like,
of the work
oh,
that, oh, go ahead. Mm-hmm,
well, I was going to go in another direction. Um,
mm-hmm,
Another thing you raised is combining activism and self-care. And ironically, this series was inspired. I saw a Palestinian activist saying on Instagram, "Don't tell us to rest," um, and it was super valid. Like, they can't rest, or it doesn't feel safe to rest, or, well, if you want me to rest, are you going to do my work for me, right? And for those of us who have some privilege and also want to be making a difference, um, like, what do you see as the value of doing things the way you're doing as opposed to the way your parents did? And
yeah,
are there any risks?
absolutely. So, um, somatics is the ways in which, you know, the physical body, the spiritual body, the emotional body, and the mental body are all intertwined, right? And when there is an actual active trauma happening to Palestine, like right now, it's like there's a hemorrhage happening, and you can't tell someone who has, you know, a bleeding arm to go take a bath, right? Like that would do them a disservice. And so the first thing that we need to do is actually successfully call for a ceasefire, right? That's the first step. And so many of us around the world have been doing that. And I would actually argue that in the collective, right? Adrienne Marie Brown, for example, talks about humans as being a part of a mycelial network. Like we're all connected. Self-care and collective care, I think sometimes there's this like false binary between the two. We're all interconnected with one another. And when people somewhere, we're actually seeing what's happening in Palestine live on social media in a way that it just couldn't happen during the Salvadoran Civil War. And so those of us who are, you know, experiencing pain due to what is happening there, like that means that our hearts are open and that we are compassionate. And actually completing the cycle of trauma means creating safety for the collective as well as for the individuals, right? So in our nervous system, what happens when something traumatic happens is that we go into fight, flight, freeze, we also talk in helping professions a lot about fawn. Like we go into trying to create safety for the collective, right? And for women, for people who are helping, people who are already previously activists, like this is a marathon and not a sprint, right? We need to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves, but that we're continuing to feed ourselves so that we can move forward as much as we possibly can. So activism, I see it as part of collective care and self-care, right? And so what happens, it causes trauma to get stuck in the body as when we're not able to create safety for ourselves or others. And so to continue to fight for a ceasefire, to continue to fight for Palestinian liberation is going to create trauma healing, right? That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, coming from, there's a lot of you listening to this might be familiar with the work of Resmaa Menakem, who does racial healing. Are you familiar with Resmaa Menakem's work?
No.
So he wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands, looking at the ways in which white bodies and Black bodies experience trauma, and the ways in which white bodies inflicting harm upon Black bodies is also trauma. And so there's these that he has a beautiful just like sequence through his book My Grandmother's Hands, to help people of all bodies to move that trauma through the body and actually increase our nervous system's capacity to do difficult work, courageous work in the world. Right?
Yeah, I just want to put in something parenthetical. I've been doing some healing work with Jewish people who are strongly opposed to the genocide, and there's a kind of trauma called you probably know what it is, moral injury, which soldiers get, right? Especially soldiers who've been involved in like massacres or things where they were involved in terrible harm,
like
and
causing harm.
Exactly. So there's a kind of trauma that happens when you have done something terrible against your will, or even if you've done it willfully, but then you realize that you've done something wrong. And
or out of ignorance.
As a Jewish person and as an American, I'm very conscious that this massacre is being done in my name. And no, it's not the same kind of trauma that the people on the receiving end are experiencing it. And it's certainly not in any way their responsibility to worry about me. But it's deep. It's deep and it's heavy.
Yeah. And waking up to the ways in which the systems that we're a part of is emotional, physical, mental work, right? Of healing what Resmaa Menakem refers to as a soul nerve. And that so much of our culture is designed to disconnect us from our soul nerve. Right? And so how can we do the work to reconnect to our soul, to our sense of aliveness again, and to even hold the places where we are still disconnected with tenderness and compassion, right? And then to learn how to be in processes that are generative and restorative, even with people who are, potentially opposition in any given moment. Like, for example, Zionists right now. How can we learn to be in conversation, be in dialogue, be in conflict, whatever level you might be engaging in dialogue at, without causing further harm to ourselves or to the other person that is going to escalate things,
Mhm,
right? And that takes skill,
mhm.
right? It takes a skill that is not easy. I've been engaging in a lot of it lately. And even before October 7th, October 6th,
No, it is
um,
it was the 7th.
is 7th, excuse me. Um, you know, this is, I feel like, the work of our times, to learn to not turn away from conflict, but to turn towards conflict in a way that is going to create reconnection. And maybe not immediately, but in some like longer arc of time, right?
Yeah, and I can't help thinking that you know, aside from perhaps some truly cynical actors in the in the Israeli government, most people who are supporting this war just have something that they haven't been heard, right? There's some pain that hasn't been, some pain or fear that hasn't been fully acknowledged,
Yeah,
that they have to keep expressing over and over again by feeling like this war is not allowed to end.
right. And so how can we somehow recognize the unmet need that is happening right now and continue to name those, and how can we come together in spaces where we can be in our pain for the world? And that's a lot of the work that I do, is I have been facilitating the work that reconnects, which is exactly about that. How can we process our grief, our anger, our numbness, for the world to be able to go forth into possibility, into our shared collective creativity for what might be possible,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep, and that's very much what this, yeah, what this series is, what the series is about, and what my work is about, and what your work is about.
Yeah,
So, Margarita, will you lead us? Will you lead us in a practice that people can make use of to be
sure. I'd be happy. In 5 minutes.
a little freer? Yeah, 5 minutes. Let's do it.
Beautiful. So I'd love to lead us in a centering practice, which is a practice that comes from, it is oftentimes taught through one of my lineages, the Strozzi Institute, and is originally from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who is a really incredible Black Buddhist teacher. And so what we're going to do is we're going to center ourselves in 4 directions in order to come up with a few words that are going to help us move further into our purpose. And so wherever you are, if you're listening, if you're watching this, closing your eyes if you feel comfortable with that, or keeping them open and maybe looking at something that's alive. And taking a few deep breaths to arrive in your body in this moment. Feeling the rib cage expanding with each in-breath and contracting with each exhale. The first direction that we're going to center in is our sense of length. So you might feel into the crown of your head as it reaches up towards the ceiling or the sky, and your tailbone as it reaches down towards the earth, feeling a little bit more space between each vertebra. And as you feel into your length, remember your inherent human dignity. And our inherent human dignity is something that not a single one of us has to earn, and that no one can take away. Whether we're in the middle of a conflict, whether we're Palestinian and in Palestine right now, we are human. And with the next breath, we'll bring our awareness to our sense of width. And you might sense the width of your physical body at your shoulders, at your hips, and the stance at your feet. You might even sense your physical width beyond your physical body, your energetic body. And this direction represents our connections to other humans and our boundaries. And in any given moment, you might notice your boundaries being more open and porous. And in other moments, they might need to be more closed. You might need to do more self-care. So just noticing where you're at in this moment without any judgment. We are like cells of a body, of a greater organism. What does this cell need in this moment to keep balance? And then we'll, with the next breath, bring our awareness to our sense of depth. Noticing our back body, all of our teachers, our ancestors that came before us, the life that we have lived so far in the past. And as we notice our front body, we might sense into where we're going. 7 generations into the future, our own family, the people that we work with, and 7 generations into the future of them. What are our goals, our dreams, our things that we're trying to manifest in this lifetime? And then finding present by finding a balance between the back body and the front body. And then with the last breath, we're going to spiral inward towards our center. And in this lineage, our center might be right underneath our belly button. So placing hands with our thumbs in the belly button so that you can actually feel your physical center. And this place represents our strength, our skills, and our sense of purpose. And so you might bring to mind a word or a few words or a phrase that represents something that feels true for you in this moment, this present moment. And then fluttering the eyes open. And if you'd like to share your word, you're welcome to do that.
I didn't find a word.
I think mine right now is truth.
I was about to say, if I had one, it would be truth.
Okay. We've got some.
Knowing, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that practice with me.
Thank you. Thank you for providing that, Margarita.
Yeah.
And before we say goodbye to folks, tell everybody about tell us about the free gift that you are offering.
Sure, yeah. The free gift that I'm offering is actually just a reading list of a few books that have been really instrumental to me in conflict resolution and somatics and trauma stewardship. And there's links to the non-corporate places where you can acquire those books if you're interested in getting them.
Very wonderful. Well, thank you, Margarita. Thank you for this great conversation and this powerful practice. And thanks for who you are in the world and what you're committed to.
Likewise, thank you so much for the space and for being here to be in conversation.
Thank you. Let me stop recording. There we go.